From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's our lineup today. K-State's DeAnn Presley on the oversaturated soils around Kansas, which have delayed spring fieldwork, and the potential for soil compaction if one travels across those wet fields with heavy equipment. She'll go over the simple ways of identifying that possibility beforehand. Stopping by also today from the Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. He'll go over the USDA support available to producers in the flood-stricken parts of northeast Kansas, as well as the assistance still available to livestock producers there and elsewhere under a pair of emergency programs. And later this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Cary Rivard on starting warm season vegetable transplants from seed. All that here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You are tuned in to Agriculture Today. As all are aware, our field soils around Kansas are wet. That's caused considerable delays in field work, which could persist for quite a while. We've brought by now from the Department of Agronomy here at K-State, Extension Soil Management Specialist DeAnn Presley, to kick around a couple of things that you producers ought to be thinking about here as we move forward. 1, avoiding compaction problems in your fields, and 2, looking around to see what, if any, damage has been inflicted on your field conservation structures. DeAnn, the soils are wet. You were looking just before we went on the air at the information from the Weather Data Library to that effect, right?
That's right. So they've got really nice data on that Mesonet site where you can click and look at the soil moistures, and you can see it has it at different depths, so 2 inches, 4 inches, and so on, a couple deeper depths. And you can see what it's got there under the sensors. Now, at each of the sites where those measurements are made, that's actually under grass, under sod. And it says that right on the page. And so you might actually, in fields, could actually have wetter soil moisture than that. We all are probably seeing the grass greening up around here. So the grass is, of course, transpiring and giving off some moisture, whereas a bare soil might be evaporating more. I would say across the board, everything is starting to dry after the weather that we've recently had. But for the next few days, there looks to be some pretty high chances of rainfall for much of the state. And so that really puts us between a rock and a hard place.
And just as a quick aside, folks, you might check out that soil moisture tool that's available on the Mesonet website out of K-State. Very informative. Soil moisture level, but one component of compaction, right?
That's, yes, a very important one. So 2 things with compaction would be, first of all, texture. So if you think about sandy soils versus silty soils versus clayey soils, they each have a little bit of different tendency. So they can actually all compact very well. A sandy soil can compact. A sandy loam, if you've ever felt that one or tried to soil sample through a dry sandy loam, it's got enough fine particles between the coarser particles that it really sets up hard, almost like concrete. So you can compact any soil texture. Of course, the clayey ones are the ones that you'll see it in for a really long time, for years to come. But the other factor is soil moisture. And so I call this the Goldilocks curve. So if you think about compaction and you think about soil moisture, do soils compact very well when they're dry? No, we all know that, right? There's air in the pores and there's just not a lot of slippage when you have a dry soil. And if you have a really wet soil, first of all, the nice thing about really wet soils is hopefully you can stay off them. But if you do traffic on them, then you usually cut big ruts. So ruts are more the problem in really wet soils. But where you get compaction that goes deep into the soil profile is at the middle, like that's where I say the Goldilocks curve, that just right, where you think it might be dry enough to get out there. especially if the surface seems dry enough. But actually, there's enough moisture that the particles can now slip and slide past each other. And so I think if you're making tracks but not cutting ruts, but if you're actually making pretty nice footprints where you can see chevrons of tires and such, that's probably that just right moisture content for causing compaction, unfortunately. So what I would suggest is, dig a hole. Don't just look at what the couple top inches is doing, but look at those next few inches too, because the thing is compaction is not just a surface issue. There's also that subsurface. So the heavier the axle load is, the more that can transmit down into the soil. And so I've seen researchers showing compaction transmitted as much as 18 inches down into soils. If, you got the conditions just perfectly wrong for lots of moisture, so that those heavy axle weights can transmit deeply. So the rule of thumb is 10 tons or more is pretty damaging to yield damaging, of course, with soils also. But so, that's a thing to think about is, of course, like a wet fall with grain carts or heavy loaded combines. That's tough, but also people hauling manure, that can be some pretty heavy equipment too. So I would suggest just dig down, and you could try, like making texture balls, but if they ribbon up pretty well like putty, probably a little wet, and it would be great if there was a few more days of drying. But again, we know rain is going to come. It's spring. It's going to come. So there's no perfect answer until we get hovercrafts or helicopters or something like that, trafficking across soils without truly putting heavy weights on them. But that's a little bit, futuristic. But it'd be cool. It'd be cool. Well, the thing is I think about compaction like high blood pressure, right? So high blood pressure, we know it's not good for you, but it doesn't exactly show up. It doesn't look like a broken arm, right? You break your arm, you go fix it, and you move on. But high blood pressure is like kind of a sneaky thing, steals your health a little bit, right? And I think of compaction like that too. Maybe the whole field doesn't look that bad, and it's just sneaking a little yield off, and so you're limiting yield potential. Now, of course, if you see deep ruts you've cut or deep traffic patterns, show up in your plants later on, that's actually one of the symptoms of compaction or signs, is that they're going to look a little stressed. They're going to look drought stressed and nutrient stressed because they just can't exploit as much soil as they would as if it wasn't compacted. So traffic patterns are a good way to see where old damage has occurred.
Abstain from field traffic till you're sure that soil is going to be in condition to handle that traffic. And do check, as DeAnn says, the simple ways that she just passed along to see where that compaction potential stands. Now, DeAnn, the other side of our conversation today, yes, we had a wet winter and so far a wet spring. Chances are we've seen some damage to terraces, to waterways, to other conservation structures in our fields. Are you hearing about or seeing firsthand incidents of those?
I have seen a few things. Those really, of course, happen when we get some just toad strangler events where we get a lot of rain all at one time. So all of the conservation structures, so your waterways and your terraces, those all have some way they were figured up. So if it's a 25-year event or whatever, they all had a design standard when they were made. And then, of course, if they've been maintained or recently been maintained, so if terraces have been, haven't been weathered down to like nothing over time, I mean, they should have, again, back to the design standard, they should have a certain amount of relief to them. So if they're farmed down to where there's only like 6 inches of height difference between the channel and the top, the terrace, that's not going to be enough to handle whatever storm they were designed for. So I'd say that's a great thing to go scout. But sort of the classic time when I know a lot of this terrace repair is done is in July. So wheat harvest time, if you're farming wheat, of course. So summertime is a great time to go and have a lot of repairs done, but you have to, if you're going to contract with like a land improvement contractor, that's, of course, when they get busy doing everybody's. But I think definitely taking a look and especially after, huge rain events. Another thing that's kind of trickier to see is waterways, grass waterways, right? And I know we're losing amounts of grass waterways in our state, but just go walk across some grass waterways and you can usually find more erosion than it looks like if there's thick grass there. So, repairing those is important too, like actually setting foot on them to check them out. I think having practices and structures together is like the best marriage. So, we talk about no-till or maybe it's cover crops. Those are obviously the on-the-field practices, but having those still with the structures and maintaining structures is, a great marriage, because we want to capture every raindrop where it falls on the field. That'd be perfect, right? But also, again, with the structures as your backup for catching these large events and slowing them down before they leave and, leave the field and take nutrients and sediment with them. So a couple things. One thing I learned last year, I was actually at a field day and I saw it and I was like, that's a great idea, was somebody had planted cover crops where some recent earthwork had been done. So I think it was some terrace repair and outlet repair and things like that. They had seeded cover crops done there. So they hadn't done the whole field. They had focused, spending their money where this dirt work had been done, earthwork had been done. and I thought that was a great idea. That's, if you don't want to spend the resources on the whole field, focusing that, on an area that's a great plan. Definitely those roots, and then eventually the above ground part, once it dies, they'll hold more soil for you. And, you spent a lot of money on doing earthwork or time if you did it yourself. That's, trying to keep it in place. And the other thing, and I learned this from an engineer from Nebraska, is maybe you've got some places where the water is concentrating and you're getting some little tiny gullies forming, even in no-till. If you've got fields where the residue just isn't long-lasting, or maybe there isn't as much residue. He was talking about basically using cover crops as temporary waterways. So patching them in certain places on the field. Again, if you don't want to spend the resources for the whole field, but just eyeballing some of those places where some problems are coming, see what you think. Try it out, see what you think. And obviously they might manage slightly different if you need to put more nitrogen fertilizer there or what have you. But still, is it better than losing soil that you then have to go clean out of terraces, or that the county will have to clean out of road ditches or whatever? So pros and cons.
Soil work is not inexpensive, so for all of those purposes, the use of a cover crop might be a novel idea. That's something to think about here. DeAnn, thank you for coming over. These are all good input for our producers as we continue to tangle with overly wet soils in so many locations. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Soil Management Specialist with K-State Research and Extension, DeAnn Presley, with those remarks. We'll be back with more. This is Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Across the way now from the Farm Service Agency here in Kansas is the State Director of the FSA, David Schemm, and we bring David by to give us a full briefing on how the FSA and USDA is responding in the wake of the floods in northeast Kansas, as well as some other complications with the weather that have afflicted producers here in the last few weeks and months. But David, we talk about and have heard so much about how rough it's been for our neighboring states to the north and east, Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri, as far as the Missouri River flooding. But northeast Kansas, the extreme part anyway, is not spared from this either.
No, they're absolutely not, Eric. And we've had a lot of producers or areas up there in that northeast part there that's been affected, particularly in Atchison, Brown, Donovan, and Leavenworth counties. We understand that there is at least some flooding maybe that has occurred over in Marshall County, but definitely our thoughts and prayers out for those producers as the devastation has really hit them, and in some areas has almost continued to hit them yet here.
Absolutely. And in fact, you are headed later today to northeast Kansas to meet with producers on the options available to them in the aftermath of the flooding. The principal tool that the USDA puts out there in response to this is the Emergency Conservation Program, you say?
Yep, that's right. ECP, or like you said, the Emergency Conservation Program, is a cost-share-based program that reimburses our producers out there. And in the example of FSA for basically repairing or getting that land back up into shape for either grazing or crop production. And so that's one of the primary tools that we use to try to help those producers out there. It's we understand that it's a process. We've got to let those waters get receded back before they can get in there and start that. But like you mentioned, we are planning on heading up there and visiting with producers to make sure they know what their options are and they can be ready when they can get in there.
The basic outline of the ECP, how does it work and what do producers have to provide, David, in the way of information?
Well, basically what they need to do is they'll need to file a cost share application with their local FSA, but going in and notifying their FSA that they want to participate in the ECP program. Like I mentioned, it's a what we would call a performance-based program or cost share-based program where ECP can really come in and help, especially in these situations like flood, is taking crop fields. They can be repaired back so they're good for agricultural production. That's such as removing debris piles, and again, like I said, to allow normal cropping or grazing activities. Also, fences can be restored through the EC program, and as well as conservation structures can be restored back to their functionality before the flooding occur. And those structures are such things as dams, ponds, sod waterways, terrace systems, various things like that will be able to be repaired back, and the producer notifies their FSA, and producers can start that recovery effort. Like I said, it is a cost-share program. It will help offset 75% of the cost for our producers, and for those limited resource producers, it can even cost-share up to 90% for them.
So it can be considerably valuable relief for producers. They need to wait until they can fully assess the damage and then go to the FSA office and file an application. And at that point, what happens?
Well, they go to that FSA office. They'll file an application. Kind of some internal processes that we have to do, Eric, is we have to do a site inspection or double check that. And we work a lot, again, with NRCS. As they start those repair, obviously, as I said, where it's a cost-based, performance-based, is keep track of those receipts, those expenses that they have going out. And when they finish up those repairs, make sure they have a tally of all those expenses with documentation to verify that. Take that into our FSA offices. We'll put that into the programs and, again, be able to issue those payments to be able to offset that expense.
But once more, the timeline here, apply for the program first and then carry out these practices as necessary.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Eric. So, again, that's going to be a primary program for our producers to be able to access here. We're hopeful. It's going to be, obviously, a lot of demand on those funds there for ECP with Iowa and Nebraska, even Missouri being involved there. So USDA, we're conscious of that, and we're trying to see and work and make sure we have additional funds available to cover all the expenses right now. Obviously, a lot of people, and we understand this, are still trying to assess the full extent of what the damage is out there and as well as the cost of the damages there. So, it's as we proceed forward, go out there, like you said, and assess that damage and contact our FSA office, and then we can get the process started.
That is the Emergency Conservation Program for livestock producers, and actually this program has been, unfortunately, active for the better part of this year. The Livestock Indemnity Program can help those livestock producers who incurred losses, well, certainly during the flooding events, but even going back to the blizzards and cold of this past winter.
No, that's exactly right. And that's the Livestock Indemnity Program, or LIP, has been an ongoing program, and especially for our producers that have a lot of challenges, obviously, with cold weather, snow, very wet conditions, a lot of mortality related, especially to our young livestock out there. And that program has been in place, and obviously it's based upon a disaster event. So even if it is a flood event, and again, producers losing livestock in a flood, they still qualify for the LIP program. The LIP program, basically, when you have that loss of livestock, what those producers need to do is come into our FSA offices out there, and basically we're needing a verifiable proof of death. It can be anything from like veterinary records or rendering truck receipt, anything like that, even pictures with make sure there are a date on them. But that gives us a verifiable proof of death, and then also a verifiable beginning inventory there for us, so that way we can understand. And then again, those are calculations that we can utilize and be able to pay those producers and reimburse them out there for that.
And the reimbursement schedule there is based on a percentage. How does that work?
It is based upon a percentage. There's a couple of factors we place in. It depends upon some of the livestock, but generally it's about a 3% reduction. So, for example, if a producer had, 100 cows and lost 3, we don't pay for the first 3 animals. That anything after that, we would pay for all of those additional animals there. Some of the parts of the program, I would like to note that had some slight changes from the 2018 Farm Bill. So our offices are definitely taking that notice of loss that producers are having out there. However, we're still waiting for some of the final regulations to be written that's been affected by the 2018 Farm Bill, and we are expecting those final notifications to be coming down and getting some clarification for us, but we're not going to be issuing payment here just right away until we do get those final regulations. But again, we are taking notice of loss for our producers, so please go ahead and come into our offices when you have that death loss and notify our offices.
And have that documentation.
Exactly.
That's the key to the Livestock Indemnity Program. One more assistance availability to producers, and this could help you, say, David, with those who have incurred hay losses or forage losses. The Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, this is different from the ECP, right?
That is correct, or ELAP as we like to call it. That one can definitely help our producers who have lost feed stocks out there, so in the flooding areas. So, if those waterways got washed away that they had feed in or around the places, depending on their various situations for the producers that was affected by these floods. That is one program. Again, if they have lost those feed stocks, come into our county offices, and when you notify them, they'll walk those producers through the process of applying for the ELAP program and helping to offset those feed stock loss.
So look into that, producers, if in fact you have suffered hay losses as well. Want to remind folks once again, David, you are heading to northeast Kansas to meet with producers in the flood-stricken areas along the Missouri River area, and that will take place, that meeting, this afternoon for anybody wishing to attend.
Yeah, absolutely. USDA is very concerned about our ag producers out there, and especially in disaster areas that have been impacted, and obviously this flood has definitely impacted some of our producers significantly. I know we have the Undersecretary and several of them touring around some of the states that have been affected by flood, but it's been definitely an effort by FSA along with the other agencies, NRCS and RMA, and we are going to be going up to the Highland Community Center today at 2:30 and having some discussion with the producers there, and again outlining the programs that FSA has, NRCS, the impact for producers, even when it comes to RMA and their insurance, crop insurance, so that they know what they can do. Obviously, our hearts and thoughts are with those people, and we want to be able to let them know that we are there to help them and help them get back into and be able to have a successful year.
Important meeting for producers in that area. Again, this afternoon, 2:30, Community Center in Highland. So hopefully producers will take note of these opportunities to get relief in these situations. David, thank you for the briefing, and we appreciate you taking the time to stop over.
Thank you.
He is the State Director of the Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. Do talk with your local FSA personnel about these emergency support programs provided by the USDA. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll stand aside for a few moments and then return with today's agricultural news headlines. Also upcoming, this week's Kansas soybean update, Greg Akagi with that, and more still ahead here on the K-State Radio Network. Stay with us.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson here. And now to today's agricultural news headlines for you, courtesy in part of DTN. The Senate has voted 90-10 to move forward to consideration of that $13.5 billion disaster aid package, but that plan will not address the current flooding in the Midwest. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said that disaster aid would get approved in piecemeal fashion as the number of disasters multiplies. Quoting McConnell here, clearly, we will be doing another supplemental here in the near future once we assess the damage in the Midwest. Now, Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri said that lawmakers had been trying to expand the aid package to include the recent flooding in Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, and Kansas. But if the price tag for those states exceeds $8 billion, he said, you would add money later to that fund. The government has the Livestock Indemnity Program, of course, as we spoke of earlier with David Schemm, for livestock lost to the storms and the flood. Nothing, though, to compensate growers for grain lost to flooding. For privately stored grain, quoting here USDA Undersecretary Greg Eibach, we do not have anything in place at USDA. He went on to say if Congress passes a disaster package, that may or may not be part of that. Crops contaminated by flooding cannot be sold for food or feeding because they would be considered adulterated. Well, many farmers say they're still undecided on exactly how much of what crops they're going to plant this spring. We will soon get at least a clue about what they were thinking anyway a few weeks ago in a USDA report. The USDA's Gary Crawford has more.
We are only hours away now from USDA's prospective plantings report, but when USDA surveyed the over 80,000 producers, asking them how much of what crops they thought they would plant this spring, that was back late February, early this month, before the major Midwest flooding, before corn prices improved a bit, and at a time when many were still expecting a U.S.-China trade deal by the end of the month. Nevertheless, the prospective plantings report will still have some
highly watched numbers when they come out on the 29th.
At least giving some indication of what farmers are thinking. Lance Honig with the USDA Statistics Service says, you may remember, last year farmers planted for the first time in 35 years more soybeans than corn.
So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens this season. Do we revert back to that obviously much more normal relationship of more corn than soybeans?
That's what many are expecting, but we've been surprised before by these reports. This one comes out this Friday, noon Eastern Time. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
Senate Finance Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley expects bipartisan legislation in the coming weeks to propose time limits on Section 232 national security tariffs. His announcement comes days after the one-year anniversary of President Trump's imposing 25% tariffs on steel, 10% tariffs on aluminum via Section 232. This legislation would impose new consultation and reporting requirements through the investigative process to keep lawmakers informed. It would also allow lawmakers to weigh in on any action by potentially limiting the lifespan of tariffs or other trade restrictions unless Congress grants an extension. The bill would require the White House to provide reports on how any trade actions are achieving national security objectives. It would also require a transparent and accountable process for requesting tariff exclusions. Well, the new Census of Agriculture will soon be released in early April. Here's a look ahead to that from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
The 2017 Census of Agriculture, which takes place once every 5 years, will be released to the public on April 11th.
The full report is a comprehensive summary of agricultural data from the United States and for each state. Some of the data items include number of farms by size and type, inventory, and values for crops and livestock.
Amanda Dawson is with the National Agricultural Statistics Service.
The report will be released at 12 noon, and it will be available in several different media formats, such as text and PDF.
And there will be tools to help the public make sense of the data, which include millions of data points from farms and ranches across the country.
Data users will have access to a plethora of census products, including full reports, maps, highlights, rankings, quick stats, and also queries.
The website is www.nas.usda.gov. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now it's on to this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Here's Greg Akagi. Greg?
Frances Graves is joining us. She is a Kansas Common Ground volunteer and rancher from Bartlett, Kansas. And what is the main purpose of Kansas Common Ground?
Our main goal is just to help people enjoy their food without fear. We're a group of women farmers who volunteer to serve as a resource for real firsthand information on how we grow our food and agriculture in general for people who don't understand it.
There are many to the consumer, many myths and misconceptions out there, which that's where you guys come into play?
Correct. No one knows food better than a farmer, and there are a lot of people who are just detached from farming these days. So our goal is just to have one-on-one conversations, either online or in person, with consumers who are out there and away from the farm, and they may have questions.
And if they go to the website, findourcommonground.com, what's so interesting about that is it really covers many different topics.
We have over 200 volunteers nationwide. We have about 15 in Kansas, and we cover topics ranging from animal welfare, pigs, cows, a lot of stuff we don't see in Kansas. And then people can come in and just write in an individual question, and we'll get them an answer on that website as well.
With so many more food choices that are available, that really expands the number of topics that you would like to cover as well?
We're always updating it, just like how farmers are continuously improving our growing practices to keep up to date. Common Ground is trying to continuously put out new information as we have new products and new questions in the food marketplace.
Do you have events throughout the year that they can be a part of?
We sure do. We've got 3 events coming up in Kansas this spring and summer. We've got an event in Junction City at the Hildebrand Dairy in April, and we've got a Yoga on the Farm event in Lawrence, Kansas in June. And we have an event in Manhattan coming up in April that's meet and greet at the meat market there in Manhattan. And all of those details can be found on our website. It's Common Ground Kansas, commongroundks.com for the Kansas details.
Common Ground was really developed from 2 checkoffs, both on the soybean side and on the corn side. Why is it important to continue to develop this program?
Well, farmers and ranchers are busy in the field. They're doing their job every day. We have organizations like Common Ground that go out there and try to meet these consumers where they are on their social platforms and in the grocery stores and places where they shop and answer their questions and promote the message that we're all working hard to produce a safe and affordable and varied food supply.
That is Frances Graves, a Kansas Common Ground volunteer and a rancher from Bartlett, Kansas. She joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi with the update. Many thanks, Greg, and we will be back after this final break. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
You're listening to Agriculture Today, and up for you now this week's horticulture segment. For you home vegetable gardeners who would like to start your own warm season vegetable transplants, you can do so yet at this time, but you need to follow certain procedures to succeed with that, and we'll cover several of those today with our guest. Cary Rivard is with us. He is an extension horticulturist for K-State based in Olathe. And Cary, this is something that a number of gardeners can take on, but once again, there is a process to this.
Absolutely. So, one of the great things about growing your own vegetables is that compared to flowers and a lot of the other, ornamentals and things, vegetables are actually relatively simple to grow as transplants. They typically only take 6 to 8 weeks, and with a little bit of germination equipment and possibly a cold frame, just about anybody can get started growing their own vegetable plants.
About the seeding itself, what do we need to think about as growers?
Well, one of the nice things is we have a lot of potting mixes that are available to us, and they do a great job of keeping the soil moisture and what really turns out to be the humidity around that seed a nice, cozy 85 to 95%. So what we want to do is keep those seeds nice and damp, but also warm, so we can tend to use like a germination mat or something like that in order to keep some bottom heat on it. And then the minute that it germinates, we want it to have really nice light exposure. So having some fluorescent lights, or there's a lot of nice LED lights that are available now, can be really helpful for that as well.
You mentioned humidity as a key component of germination and emergence of those new seeds, and that also associates with the elongation of the shoot, which is important to the hardiness of the plant. What beyond the planting medium itself can one do to manage that humidity?
Yeah, so we want to get as high humidity as we can, especially during the first 5 to 7 days when that germinating seedling is popping, right? And so there's a lot of tricks you can do as a home gardener in order to help promote that high humidity. Now, again, it's really important to have your seedling trays on a heating mat or a germination mat so that they're not cool and damp. Mm-hmm. You want them to be warm and damp. But what I have done is I've used just plain old, kitchen cling wrap, the clear wrap you can use in your kitchen to cover your mixing bowls and stuff, and I've just put that across the seedling tray, and that again just makes a little greenhouse dome inside of the tray in order to keep that humidity nice and high. Now the key, if you are going to do something like that, the minute those seedlings come out of the ground, you want to take that off, because if you do leave it in that high humidity condition, once they pop out of the ground, that could lead to disease. So you want to keep a really close eye on the plants. And the minute you get, 50% germination or so, and they're just starting to emerge out of the soil, you can go ahead and pop that off.
What about fertilizing those planted seeds and the emerging plants afterward? Do we need to pay attention to that?
Yeah, so the general rule of thumb is actually to not fertilize seeds when they're germinating. Now, once they've transplanted and they're a couple, 3 weeks old, it is really important to give them a shot of starter fertilizer. But when that transplant is actually growing, or really that germinating seedling is growing, it's getting all of its nutrients from within the seed. And everything it needs to grow comes from within that seed. So it's actually can be a problem if you add fertilizer. Sometimes there's certain species that the fertilizer will actually inhibit the germination rate of the seedlings.
Light is important here. You already mentioned that, and you want to continue full exposure to the sun or artificial light right up to the point where those seedlings, those transplants are taken outside?
That's right. So, once they form a true leaf, usually the first 2 leaves that develop on a vegetable plant will be what we call the seed leaves or the cotyledon leaves. And then they're going to start to form true leaves, and those are leaves that actually look like the plant typically looks as a full-grown mature plant. Now, those are going to be photosynthetically active leaves. So the minute you have true leaves, you want to do your best job to simulate the full sun as you can. If you're growing indoors, that means using a lot of bright lights, or if you can, go ahead and move those things outside. And, as a home gardener, one thing I find myself doing is taking transplants in and outside on days like today when it's 30 degrees at night but 65 during the day. You can just take those little guys outside and put them on your deck and let them enjoy the sun, and then at night when it starts to cool off, just bring them back inside.
All right. And then if everything goes well, one can expect good emergence and growth, and then it's a matter of acclimating those plants to the conditions outdoors for good. It's what's called a hardening process.
That's right, and especially here in Kansas, that's really important. We have such strong winds and such wild weather extremes that making sure that plant is not real spindly and juvenile is going to be really important before you put it outside. So we typically want to have about a 7 to 10 day hardening off period where they're going to be exposed to full sun and full wind as well. Now, you can do that in something like a cold frame, but I've even hardened off plants, on the side of my house, like the southern exposure of a house where it has a little bit of protection from the wind, but it still gets full sunlight. That can be a really nice place. Keep in mind, if your plants are all growing together in a tray or a cell pack, then they're going to have some protection just by the plants being all crunched together, right? So if you can just kind of put them somewhere where they're going to get full sun, then that can be a really nice place to harden them off, again, for 7 to 10 days before they go outside. Any other basics to getting those vegetable transplants up and going then, Cary? Well, I think one of the most important things for folks to remember is, this time of year we get really excited because we get all our seeds in. We want to start them all right away. But you really want to work with a calendar and think about when you actually plant your transplants. As you mentioned earlier, some transplants will take 6 to 8 weeks, but there's others that only take 3 to 4 weeks, right? So things like cucurbits, cucumbers and pumpkins and melons, that kind of stuff you really don't want to seed until, you're really close to that frost-free time, right? Whereas things like eggplant and peppers take almost a full 8 weeks, and tomatoes are somewhere in between. They're probably 5 to 6 weeks, depending on how, what kind of conditions you have growing. So one of the things I like to do is when I get my seeds in for the spring, I actually set up a calendar that basically has a planting date of, say, the second weekend in May, and then work backwards from that calendar. So your cucurbits, you want to put in about a month ahead of time. Your tomatoes, maybe 6 weeks. Your peppers and your eggplant, maybe 8 weeks. And you can use that timeline so that you have the right size plants on the right day, and you can put them in the right form. We appreciate you covering all of this with us, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks so much, Cary. It's been great chatting with you. Thank you. That's Cary Rivard. He's an extension horticulturist based in Olathe for K-State Research and Extension. Standard procedures as far as growing one's own vegetable transplants. That is this week's K-State Horticulture segment. Our time's away for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.